So this is a lesson on land art. And as early as kind of the late 60s, artists began to kind of respond to growing concerns about environmental concerns. Um, in architecture, there was a movement in New Mexico called Arco Santi, and it was really trying to, an idea called arcology, how archaeology, architecture and ecology can come together, and basically how do we develop urban systems in relationship to the environment. So that's not what we're going to talk about today, but I wanted to just let you know that architects, right now we think about green architecture and we try to think about how do we have a smaller footprint. A lot of the artists were trying to engage with the environment and bring awareness to form in the environment, but as well as natural processes. Um, and so there was quite a wide variety of human of works that spoke about different human relationships to nature, right? At one end of the spectrum, perhaps, you would have cooperation with the environment, how we might work with things. Um, we're going to, and then also how some artists used bulldozers, dump trucks, and became monumental in their relationship to the land. Okay, and then this begins primarily as an American movement. We'll start off looking at Alice Aycock, and you know, if we think about America, idea of manifest destiny and the idea of as long as there's been land, Americans have expanded, and at some point, right, we begin to saturate, even though there's vast areas of land still in America. Artists began to engage with it. Here in this piece called Maze, right, is creating this form. It's almost Stonehenge-like, right, in the middle of a farm in Pennsylvania, and one could get lost in there. Um, but it's built right out of fences, and yet each area, right, it's surrounded by nature, and each area it is exposed so that um, you can have a interaction with nature, albeit um, mitigated or um, connected to a human um, manipulation of it. Okay, so she's mediating your experience of nature by forcing you through a particular path, right, to see an outcome, which is in the center. It's just the farmland itself. Okay. Here's another piece of hers from 1971 called Sand and Fans, and here's another installation view of it. It's kind of boring. She speaks of it that way. Um, you don't see a lot of activity. It's just over time, the sand creates these ripples and dunes the way you would in an actual desert, but on a very small scale. And so this is where an artist is working with processes of nature to get us to see it. Not trying to shock us, not trying to, create a new landscape for us to see, but rather to engage with the processes of nature and of the land. This is perhaps quite different, right? It's not about the processes. This is Richard Serra's installation East-West, West-East in Qatar. And Richard Serra works with massive amounts of rolled steel, and they're incredibly heavy and very industrial in their kind of components versus something like this, which is far more delicate, or even this, which is being constructed in a more kind of impermanent way in nature. Eventually, these pieces will oxidize and create patinas, but they should last many, 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 many years. Here's another view. and the scale is enormous. Do you know how high these are? These are no, okay. They're quite large, and here's another one of Richard Serra's pieces. Te Tuhirangi Contour. This is at the Gibbs Farm in New Zealand. And here, you know, it runs throughout the landscape. And the way he got to that landscape was by walking it and trying to make sense. You can see the little sheep there. I think that sheep is really cute. Is how could his work both interrupt the landscape and be a part of the landscape to get us as a viewer to see ourselves in relationship to the landscape differently. Okay? This is an artist, Christo. He's generally known as Christo, but he works with his wife, Jean-Claude. And in this particular piece, back in 1968, he wrapped the cliffs and coasts of Sydney in Australia, and pretty amazing. 100 million square feet, which is 37 miles, of polypropylene and rope to do this 80-foot high cliff. So it's a massive piece, and it just went on and on and on. Here's another one called Running Fence by the duo. This went 24.5 miles long. And this was in Sonoma and Marin counties in California. And here's another one that I had the privilege of experiencing. This was gates in Central Park. There were many thousands of gates. And I'll speak to this one on the right because this is part of my memory. I didn't take this photo, but I have many photos very similar that I did take. And this particular orange captured with the light against the snow was pretty stunning and astounding, and I loved it. And you can imagine this in a morning light or in dusk and how it would pick up the colors of the sky. And so with these pieces, it's quite interesting, right? Because, like, for example, I'll give you an overheard conversation. I was in Central Park, and New Yorkers, can be complaining. So New Yorkers were complaining about what the heck are these stupid gates? This color, it's everywhere. It's annoying. Everybody's just standing around looking, blah, blah, blah. All right. Anyway, so some people complained. Most people loved it. But the interesting thing about it is that after they were gone, you remembered them. And I still remember them. And this is an interesting artist, unlike Richard Serra, whose work is about as permanent as you can be in the landscape. Christo's work transforms the landscape radically, but then leaves it back where it was when it was done. So that's something also for you to consider when you're comparing works. This is Walter Di Maria. This is another piece I've had the privilege of being in. It's a loft in Soho, here in Manhattan. It's like a pretty large loft, and there's 140 tons of earth there and nothing else. It smells like earth, and it's just earth. And it's especially a pleasant place to visit if you're a New Yorker because you're surrounded by images everywhere, everything nonstop, and to walk up to this room and to just look at it, it's pretty peaceful. Here's another one of his pieces, Walter Di Maria. It's called Lightning Field. He installed this in 1977, and these are large stainless steel rods that stick up out of the ground in New Mexico. And what they do is during a lightning storm, they will attract lightning. And so this is an interesting approach to thinking about land and the environment in relationship to art making, right? So the piece becomes the installation, but also what happens as a result of it. Here's a piece which ends up being a map with, a little bit of a line on it that's drawn. Remember how we were talking a little bit about Fluxus and the documentation? and this idea of life and art coming together. Richard Long's 10-Mile Walk in England, and it's just a map of the walk that he took. Here's a 100-mile walk, and here he's adding some other elements, right? In 1971-72, he did this piece, and he followed a circular route, okay? But day one, take a look there on the right. It says winter skyline and north wind. Day 2, the earth turns effortlessly under my feet. Day 3, suck icicles from grass stems. Day 4, as though I had never been born. Day 5, in and out of the sound of rivers over familiar stepping stones. Day 6, Corinna, Corinna. Day 7, flop down on my back with tiredness, stare up at the sky, and watch it recede. So, he becomes aware right here. Take a look. He records his experience of sounds, how he became aware of the presence of rivers as he approached them, pockets of sound in gullies, and how the sound disappeared behind him as he walked on. The work for this concerns both internal feelings and thoughts of the artist and external aspects of his experience during the walk. Corinna, Corinna is a reference to a folk song sung by Bob Dylan. And one of the things he does a lot of text pieces that sort of pull out little whispers of his experience, both internally and externally, about his walks. And Richard Long takes lots of walks for his work. And the last piece we'll look at is probably the most famous piece. It's called Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. And this is in Utah at the Great Salt Lake. And, for many years, this was completely underwater. You couldn't see it anymore. But there's been enough drought so that it emerges. And depending on the sort of tide, it moves in and out. It's a really interesting piece and another one that's massive. All right. Well, I'll leave it at that. You can refer back to this, especially for your assignment. I think I try to keep it short and sweet and concise. But any questions, please indicate them below. Thank you.